I'm going to show you how I made this shirt dress. I'm Ali and I've been dressmaking since I was 15, which is quite a long time ago. So as you can imagine, I've made hundreds of dresses in this time. I'll show you everything you need to know, from how to make the made to measure pattern for making the dress, cutting the collar, doing the placket, all of those details, right through to how to sew it up with a professional finish so you can get all these details absolutely perfect. You don't need to follow the tutorial exactly. You can make it shorter if you just want a shirt. You don't need to make it so fitted. You can do the sleeves a little bit different. You can do a different collar shape. There's so many variations from this tutorial, but it shows you all of the fundamental things you need to know to make a shirt or a shirt dress. So I think that's the end of the intro. So let's get straight on with making the pattern. I'm making this pattern from a fitted bodice block. If you don't have a fitted bodice block, there's a link above and below to my video on drafting a bodice block. You can use any fitted bodice block as long as it fits you really well. It doesn't have to be mine. All bodice blocks are going to be pretty much the same. So the first thing I've done is I've traced around that. So I've left a little bit of room. These are the side seams because I'm going to bring this out because it's going to be A-lined. And I've left quite a bit of space at the centre front because I need to add on a button stand and quite a big seam allowance for a placket and stuff like that. So that very first thing is just to trace this off. So I don't want my shirt dress to be super tight. So I'm adding 8 centimetres of ease. So that's the total. Obviously this is only half of my pattern because I'm going to be cutting 2 pieces, one on the fold for the back and 2 pieces for the front. So I need to add 4 centimetres of ease in total. So some will go on the front and some on the back. So that means it's 2 centimetres on each piece. So if we just look at the front, if I add 2 centimetres all to the side seam, then this seam here is going to appear too close to the front. So I'm going to do a little bit of both. I don't want to add too much to the centre front because then this bust point is going to be too wide. So I'm going to add on 0.5 centimetre to the centre front, and I'll do the same at the back, and I'll add 1.5 centimetres onto the side seam. So I'm just going to redraw those lines now on the front and on the back. So you can see here the new lines that I've drawn on. You can see it's adding in quite a bit of ease. So I'm just going to rub out the previous lines. I normally draw my lines much lighter if I'm not making a video because you don't want all these rubbed out lines still visible. I've just drawn these quite heavy so that you can see them. So that's the previous lines now gone. So that's my ease added in. And the next thing I'm going to do, I don't want it quite so fitted on the waist. And this is quite a big dart here, which is great if you're making a fitted dress, but I don't want it as fitted as that. So I'm just going to bring this in 0.5 centimetre on each side. And that's basically adding in 1 centimetre in total of ease. So I'm just going to rub out that line and I'll just redraw that to the new points. The next thing I'm going to do is lower this armhole because I don't want it really tight fitting. I don't want my armhole to sit right in my armpit. So I'm just going to do that by eye. That's how much I feel like it needs to go down. So let's measure it. It's exactly 1 centimetre. So I'm just going to do exactly the same on that side. And then I'm just going to redraw in this armhole shape. And then I can get rid of the previous seam line. The back of a shirt usually has a seam across here. And this piece is called a yoke. So I'm going to draw that on next. And I've already worked out I want that 13 centimetres down. That's just by looking at some other similar clothes I have. And then on the front, what I'm going to do, I don't want my dart going straight up, but I do want some bust shaping. So I'm going to keep all these darts, but I'm going to just change it to a princess seam. So I just need to decide what angle I want this here. So I don't want the seam to come up too high. I don't want it to be too rounded. So I'm going to go somewhere in between. So I'm going to try drawing it from here and just see how it looks. So recommend definitely drawing that quite light to start with. And that looks like a reasonable shape to me. So I'm just going to go over that. So that's my princess seam done. And now I can close up this dart. I don't want to cut the whole thing out yet, but it is a good idea to get this dart closed up. So I've cut along the princess seam and I've cut one side of the dart. And all I need to do is just close this up and just stick this in place. Hopefully you'll do a better job than me because I got my sellotape caught up. So I've made a bit of a mess of that, but that doesn't matter at the moment. The next thing I'm going to do is add on my button stand. So I just need to measure the diameter of my buttons. So mine measure 14 millimetres. So very straightforward. I just need to add 14 millimetres all the way down my centre front. And it really is as simple as just drawing that new line, and then I'm just going to label this button stand and centre front, because it might get a bit confusing later because there's going to be a few lines. So the next thing I'm going to do is mark the length of my shirt dress. So I've measured that I want it to be 45 centimetres from the waist to the hem. So I am literally just going to measure that in a few parts, and then I can just draw that line in at the bottom. Hard to get the whole piece of paper fitting on the screen, but that's pretty straightforward, just to draw that bottom line in. I've just moved that camera a little bit to show it better. So you've got the bodice, this is the front, and I've just extended it all the way down to the hem. And then what I need to do is I need to extend both of these lines all the way down to the hem. So my centre front I moved by 0.5 centimetre, so I'm just going to draw that in, and then my button stand was 14 millimetres from that new centre front line. So now I've done that, I can just continue that all the way down to the hem. And then I'll just rub the previous line out just to avoid any confusion. So the last thing I want to do before I cut these out and I start playing around with the collar and the sleeve and everything is I need to just draw in this side seam and see what I want to do for adding fullness here, because it's going to be A-line. So you just need a rough measurement of your waist to your hip. So mine measures 23 centimetres to the fullest part of my hip. That's probably quite average. So just draw a line at that point. So I now need to mark in the hip position. So I've taken a measurement, and this measurement is the total width of my dress, not my hip measurement. I want to add a fair bit of ease in there because I don't want it to be tight. And I'm just going to divide that by 4. So this measurement, 28.5 centimetres, is what I need to measure from the centre front and the centre back on my hip line. And then all I need to do is just join my waist to my hip with a slight curve on the front and on the back. So I've got quite a straight hip on the front and a really curved hip on the back. So all I'm going to do, just to make this slightly less exaggerated, is I'm going to move my waist over by 0.5 centimetre on both. So I'm adding a little bit into the back and taking a little bit out of the front, and I'm just going to rub out these side seams and redraw them with this new waist position. So I'm not changing the size, I'm literally just evening it out so that my hips are more even when I come to sew it up. So before I rub out the previous line, you can see now these are going to be much more similar. So let's just rub out the previous line. I think I've rubbed out half of the new line as well. It just means that it's just going to sew with a much better seam if these are more similar in shape. So that's the side seam done now, and they're still a little bit different, but they're much more similar, so that's going to work a lot better. So now we have to just finish off this dart. I'm doing 11 centimetres, and then when I make up a sample I can decide if that needs to be longer or shorter, but that's quite an average depth of a front dart. So just extend the line down and draw that in, and then at the back just mark the centre point there. And I'm gonna do this one 12 centimetres and just join that up. So that's the darts now finished. I now need to just think about the hem. So what I now need to do is I need to finish this line down to the hem. So I'm just going to, by eye, just continue that line on both sides. And that just looks like a natural continuation. And then I want to do the same on these darts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the position of the dart here, the same at the bottom. I'm going to do exactly the same on the front and back for this. And I'm just going to draw that line there. And then what I want to do, if I use a longer ruler, I just need to work out, I don't want to go as A-line as this to continue that dart like that. I'm just going to bring it in a little bit, but still adding a bit of fullness. And that looks like a nice natural kind of position. So I'll measure that there, and I just need to measure exactly the same on the opposite side of the dart. and then I can complete that. So that is my front now done. I'll explain how to cut this out in a second because obviously these overlap. So I've done exactly the same on the back, but I've just made it a little bit wider just because I want my skirt to be a little bit fuller at the back. We're only talking like 0.5 centimetre difference, but it's just added a bit more. So this is now ready to cut out so I can do my sleeve and my collar, and then we're done with the pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut up these side seams and separate these pieces. So if we look at the front first, I've cut the length and I've cut the side seam. I'm not going to cut my centre front because I'm going to add a bit extra on that for doing the placket. But I do need to separate my centre front and my side front. But this line on this side is for the centre front and this one on this side is the side front. So what I don't want to do is cut anything off. So all I'm going to do is I'll cut up one side. So this is the seam for this piece here. So I've cut just past the dart, but obviously if I leave it like that, then I'm losing a piece off my centre front. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the bits of paper that I've just cut off. I'm going to lift that up and then I'm just going to put that behind there. You don't have to worry about lining up your dots and crosses because it's only a little bit. Oh, so I'm just going to stick that on there. And now I'm going to use that to draw this extra piece. So I can just draw across the bottom. I can mark where this line is here. And then all I need to do is just join that line to that dart. So that's basically just traced off this piece here. So I can cut that at the bottom. And then when I cut up here, I've not lost any of the fullness. So if I just cut to the same kind of point and I can cut that off there. So you can see now that that lines up with that. So when this is made up, that's your little bit of fullness at the front. So I can now just carry on and separate these two pieces. So I've got my two front pieces now separated and I've done this the same on the back. And then before I finish cutting the back out, I just need to extend this line up. I'm just going to go straight up with that seam into the yoke. So I can now just cut the rest of this out. And while I'm doing it, I'm just going to cut straight across my yoke seam here. So I'll finish cutting all these pieces out. So I've got a little dart in my yoke, but I don't really want to have this dart on the finished garment. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of it. So it's 0.5 centimetre either side of the dart. So I'm going to take 0.5 centimetre from there and I'll just draw it to the same kind of point as that. So I'm just going to reshape my armhole very slightly. So I'll rub out the previous bit. And then I'm just going to do the same on the other side where my neck is. I'm not going to draw in the neckline yet because I'm going to show you what I'm doing with the neck in a second. So I'm now going to just rub out this dart. So that is my yoke ready, other than just adjusting the neck, which I'll do in a second. So this is both my shoulder seams, and my shirt dress isn't going to be as fitted as what the fitted block is. So this shoulder slope doesn't need to be quite as steep. So I just want to bring this down a little bit. So I'm going to just bring this down by 0.5 centimetre on both pieces, and I'll just redraw in that shoulder slope. And because that's going to be cut off, I won't bother rubbing it. I'll just put a little wiggly line through it just to show that that's coming off. So that is my new shoulder position. And then what I want to do is I want to open up this neck. With a fitted bodice block, the neck is really, really tight. So what I don't want is a shirt collar that is strangling me. So I'm going to bring this down by 1.25 centimetres at the front. And I'm going to open it up by 1 centimetre on the shoulder. And then I just need to draw this in nice and rounded, which I just do by eye. Unfortunately, I've got sellotape on there where I made a bit of a mess earlier, so it's hard to draw on that. And then before I cut it, I'm just going to stick that together there. So that is the new neck shape drawn in, and that's why I didn't want to finish off this neck completely. So this is the new neck position since getting rid of that dart. So 1 centimetre is what I brought that over here. So I'm going to mark 1 centimetre across from there. So that's the new neck position there. And then this measures 10.5 centimetres. So I'm going to measure 10.5 centimetres from there. And that brings me to this point here. The same way that I've lowered this at the front, I'm going to lower it a little bit at the back, but I'm just going to do this by eye to just maintain that same shape. You don't want this going too low at the back or your collar's going to sit really funny, but you don't want to keep it as high as it was because that is going to be really high for a shirt collar. So that's a good new position. So I'm just going to cross that out. And then for the last thing I need to do is just to reshape this armhole. So if I just put my yoke back with my side back piece, this needs to just be shaped down here. And it shouldn't need much adjusting on the other piece at all, but you just want to make sure everything lines up. So that just takes the tiniest little bit off. If you feel like this is going in too much, you can just make your shoulder a little bit wider and that will just change this shape a little bit here. But I want mine quite fitted with little cap sleeves, so I don't want my shoulder seam to be really wide. So I just need to now finish off the armhole, making sure everything lines up. But what I'm going to do as part of the detail is I want to move this seam forward a little bit, so you just see that seam from the front a little bit. So I'm just going to draw that visually where I think that's going to look nice. And I'm just going to cut along that seam. And then what I need to do is I need to cut my back piece off. So I know that my neck needs to line up there. So I'm just going to stick that on with this all lined up. So I'm not adding or taking anything away. I'm literally just moving the seam. So this bit that's come off the front is now going onto the back. But you can see it doesn't line up here. So what I'm going to do is just line all that up, and I'm not going to stick it because I'm not going to be able to draw over the tape. I don't want to make this come in, so I'm going to bring the front out to match that up. And I'm just going to draw in that shape there. So if I take that away, I'm just rubbing out this little bit here. And that is my armhole shape for the front. And then I'll rub out that little bit there. And then before I cut it, I'm just going to make sure that's all stuck down. And that's now my armhole shape for my back yoke. So hopefully that all makes sense. You've got your centre front piece here, that joins at the shoulder, make sure it matches up with the armhole and the neck. Then this is your yoke and these are your 2 back pieces. So the last bit I need to do is I just need to cut off this neck. So just make sure it doesn't go to a funny shape at this point here. It's just nice and rounded and continual. So now that neck's cut off, that looks a lot cleaner. It can get a little bit confusing once you've got loads of lines everywhere, but once you cut the pieces out, it's much easier to see. So the last bit before I do the collar is how to do the placket. So there are various ways how to do it, but for this video, I'm just going to do it the most simple way because I don't want it to get any more complicated than it needs to be. So this point here is your centre front. So that's where your button's going to sit. So let's just draw a button on roughly just to try and explain what's what. So that is the size of my button, and then that sits on that centre front line, and that's the edge. That's what you're going to see as the edge of the button stand there. So we need to have enough fabric for it to fold under and then fold under again, so it's got a nice neat finish. So you want the edge of this bit behind to sit past this button. So if I just draw in the width of the button stand, let's just draw that in again. And that brings you to here. But you want a little bit of overlap behind because we're going to do a stitch line at this position here, so it's nice and even. So you want to extend it to about 3 millimeters past there. So what I need to do is take the measurement from this line here to this point here. So 3.1 centimeters. So this point here basically meets up with this point here. So let's just draw that in a little bit. But then you want it to fold under again just to make it nice and neat. You don't want it quite as wide as this because you don't want it bulking up at this centre front point. So I'm going to measure it just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to do that at 2.9 centimetres. So that's here. So that is the fold line, and that there is the cut line. So I've not added any seam allowance to the rest of the pattern because that's nice and easy to add on as I'm cutting it out. But for this bit I'm going to, because that's quite a wide piece. So from the edge of the button stand, mine measures exactly 6 centimetres. So I'm just going to mark that all the way down the centre front and then draw a line, and I can cut this pattern piece out. So that's all of my body pieces now cut out. So I just need to do the sleeve and the collar and collar stand. So we're going to do the sleeve. So what we need to do is measure each of these pieces of armhole. So I'm going to line my tape measure up like this, and I'm going to push it against the cut edge, and I'm going to measure each individual bit. So this one measures 14 centimetres. So I'm just going to write it in there, and I'll do the same on all the others. Once you've got all the individual measurements, just add them all together, and that is your total armhole. It's called the SCYE, S-C-Y-E, and that for me measures 44.9, but 45 is definitely near enough. So to do my sleeve, I've got my measurement that I just took from my pattern, which the total was 45. So what I've done is I've taken that 45 and divided it by 4, and that gives me my sleeve head. Because it's not a really fitted garment, I don't want a really high sleeve head, so that generally works out okay, but you can always adjust that once you've made up a sample. So this is 11.5 centimetres down here, and then I've measured around my arm how tight I want my sleeve, and that's what I've measured here, which is 39 centimetres. So that's the first thing to draw, and then this measurement here is 3 centimetres. That is the length I want. That's where I've measured on the inside. I've just measured this against a t-shirt that I've got, so that's how long I want it. We just need to now draw in the sleeve head. So I need to mark the halfway point. So mine was 39 centimetres, so at 19.5, I'm just going to mark that point there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to join that point there to either side. And then this one on this side, I'm just going to divide that in half. So 22.5, so 11.25. I just mark that piece there. And then at the front, I want to divide that into 3. So that measures 22.5. So we'll divide that by 3. So 7.5. And I want to measure that from this point here. And that just helps me to draw my curve in, but you do need to kind of do it a little bit by eye as well. So at the back here, you only want to dip that down very slightly, and it crosses over roughly where that halfway point is. You need that pretty flat at the top. And then when it comes around here, it needs to meet this point here. And then it needs to come in a little bit more at the front, just because it gives you a bit more movement. So that just needs to look like a natural shape. You don't want any weird bits sticking up or it looking really extreme. So where this halfway point is here, you might end up going slightly to one side or the other. I feel like to look right, it needs to just come past here a little bit, but just play around with that curve until that looks like a nice regular curve. So I've just rubbed out the other lines so you can see it. So because that was a straight line and this is now curved, it's going to be very slightly longer, which means you need to ease it in. But a lot of this depends on how wide you've actually done your sleeve. You can draw your sleeve head from your armhole, but the problem with this is if you've got quite wide arms, you can draw it from your armhole and then it's not going to fit around your arms. So I always think it's a better way to start from the circumference of your arm and then draw your sleeve head in, and then you can work out if you need to gather it or if you need to make your armhole a little bit bigger accordingly. But that all happens when you make a sample to try it out. I'd always recommend doing a sample first. If you have got quite wide arms, and so this is fairly wide, and you find that you're having to have a lot of gathering to get this into your armhole, the other option is to make your armhole a little bit bigger. So you don't want to add to the shoulder because it's going to make it a funny shape. But what you can do is you can just lower this armhole a little bit and it will just make it slightly longer. Or you can bring it out a little bit here as well. That will make it longer. Or just do a combination of the both. So if I just draw this down here, if this is my armhole here and I wanted to make it a little bit longer, what I would do is I'd just make it a little bit wider here. It's not going to make much difference to the bodice fit, but you're adding a little bit of length And if you lower it as well, you're adding a little bit of length just by that curve being wider. So you just need to play around with it, but you should be able to ease a little bit of fullness in without it being gathered. You might have noticed while I was working on it that there was a few lines down here because I had planned on doing the cuff a certain way. But once I played around with it, I decided on doing it differently. So this is going to have a little bit of a turn up, and I'll show you when I come to make it up how I'm going to do this. So to do the whole process, from this line here, which is the sleeve head line, I've drawn 8 centimetres, and that's what I'm going to cut. I'm not adding another seam allowance onto that. It's just the 8 centimetres that are here. Just like the armhole, I've measured my openings. So this is my back neck, and the front you need to measure to this button stand line, not the centre front. Your button stand goes all the way to the edge, so you need to measure to there. So just measure both of those and then add those together for your collar. So this is a fairly straightforward collar. So this is the total measurement that I've taken from the neck on my pattern. So this is the centre back point, and this is the edge of the button stand. So I've measured up here 3 centimetres, and this is 5.5. So this is a pretty standard collar stand height, and the collar, that's kind of down to what you want, but I find that's quite a good measurement for the centre back. The next thing you want to do is you want to just divide that in half, and then divide that in half again. You can just take your measurement and divide it by 4 on a calculator, but I just find that's a much quicker way of doing it. And then just draw a line up here. So I'm just going to draw across here where my centre front is. So my button is 1.4 centimetres, so I know that's the distance from the button stand. That's my centre front point there. So that's just going to be dependent on the size of your button. And at that point there, I'm just going to measure up 0.5 centimetre, and then I'm just going to draw this with a curve, and I'm going to extend it over like that. And that just gives it a little bit of shape at the front. And now I just need to draw in my collar shape. So this is the centre front here. I don't want my collar to start there. I'm going to just draw on here where my button is. So that's the width of my button there, if I just kind of draw roughly. So I want my collar to start just inside of where that button is. So I want it to start about here. So I just need to draw the shape that I want. So I'm going to have it coming out a little bit. And from this line here is where you then shape it up. So you can go as big or as small as you want. I've drawn that with a little bit of a curve. So I'm just going to just draw a straight line just so I can see how far off. So I'm not happy with how curved that is. So I'm just going to draw a straight line, and then I'm going to curve it in a little bit from there. This is definitely worth making a sample piece first. So you can shape it, if you want quite a big collar, you can shape it a little bit beyond this point here, but you don't want to go too far past it. So that is the shape I'm going to go with. I just want a pretty standard collar shape. And now I just need to join this with a bit of a curve here. And that's the front of the button stand. That looks probably a little bit too shallow, so just play around with that till it looks nice. If you've got a shirt, just have a look at the shape of that, and then your buttonhole is going to go on there, so make sure it's big enough to put your buttonhole on. As you can see, there's a few rubbed out lines. I've played around with that a little bit until I was happy with it. You've got to make sure you like the shape. So that is that shape all done. Now we just need to add a bit of shape to it so that it sits nice and flat. So at the centre back here, I'm going to measure 3/4 centimetre or 7.5 millimetres up here, and then I'm just gonna shape the collar like that, and that's just gonna help it sit much better. It's like putting a dart in here, it gives it a better shape. If you're doing a loose fitting shirt, this is enough shape, but because this is a fitted shirt, I'm just going to add a little bit more shape to my button stand. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to mark a few points. You can just do this by eye, it doesn't need to be specific measurements. So I'm just going to mark 3 points where I'm going to overlap this very, very slightly. And I'm literally going to do it by 1.5 millimetres on each bit. It doesn't seem much, but it's enough to give it a little bit of a curve. So those 3 bits that I'm going to lose, they all add up to 4.5 millimetres. So I need to take that off my centre back on my collar piece, or it's no longer going to fit. So I'll just scribble that line out. So that's the collar piece done. and this is the stand. So I'm going to cut both of these out and then I can put these little overlaps in. So just make sure when you're cutting it out, the collar follows this top line. The collar stand follows the other line. So I'm going to cut down here. And then this little sliver in between, this just gets discarded. So you can see by doing that, it just adds a little bit of shape, and we're going to have some shape added on here as well. So what I'll do, rather than cutting it all out, I will show you this shape first. This isn't the way you would do it when you're actually making it, but just to show you, I'm cutting that and I'm overlapping this. I'm doing it to that little line. Like I say, it's only a tiny amount, but it's enough just to give this collar stand a little bit more shape. So you can see now that's given the collar stand just a slight curve, and you've taken this bit out here. So it's making what was very flat a little bit more three-dimensional. Now that's all cut out, you can see much better how much shape that's got. So you only need a subtle bit of shaping on the collar stand because you don't want it coming right into your neck, but just sticking straight up on this fitted style. I just think it looks nicer if you get that little bit of overlap, and then doing this little bit of shape on here. It just adds another little bit of shape to the collar to make it sit really well. So if you're making a sample of your entire dress, before you make up the real one, play around with this. You can always change this shape or change this depth once you've seen how it looks on. I can't fit it all onto the screen, but this is what you should have. If you prefer, you can trace around these and draw on a seam allowance, but one of the reasons I like to not have a seam allowance is if I make my dress the first time and once I'm wearing it, I think, oh, I wish I'd have just done this, or I wish I'd just done that. Just little things, like if you wanted the armhole a slightly different shape, you sometimes don't know until you've worn it a few times. It means it's so easy to then adjust. If you've put a seam allowance on it, it just makes it a bit more tricky to adjust it in future. I've got everything now cut out. I've cut 2 of each of the main body pieces and the sleeve. I didn't add anything at the bottom because I'd already taken that into account when I was doing the pattern, because this is going to be folded back. And I've added 1 centimetre all the way around. And then for all the body pieces, I've added 1 centimetre all the way around, and I've added 3.5 centimetres at the hem. On the centre back, I've cut it on the fold. And then on the centre front, I've not added any seam allowance at the front because, again, like the sleeve, I've already added that when I worked out my placket. So for the yoke, I've cut 2 pieces on the fold with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So for my collar, I've cut 1 in the main fabric on the fold, and I've put some lightweight iron-on interfacing on it. You don't have to do that, but this is quite a lightweight cotton, so I decided to. If I was using a heavier fabric, sometimes I don't put any kind of interfacing on it at all. And this all has a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around. And then for the inner collar, I've used a different fabric just because I thought it'd be quite funky to have something different. You're hardly going to see it, but it's just that little hint of something different. And I have cut a 1 centimetre seam allowance down the bottom, and it's a 1 centimetre seam allowance at the point of the collar, and then I've tapered that in to be 8 millimetres down the front here and all the way around this bit. And this is cut on the bias. You can see by the way the dots are that I've cut this on the bias, and that just gives it a little bit of stretch to mould around your neck a bit better on the inside. And then likewise for the collar stand, I've got 1 piece with some interfacing for the collar stand with 1 centimetre all the way around. And then for the inner collar stand, I've cut 1 centimetre all the way around. This is again on the bias. The only bit I've done 8 millimetres is this little bit at the front here, and then I've changed it to 1 centimetre once it gets on this curve. So it's just this tiny little bit here. And that's just to make sure that this fabric stays on the inside and isn't visible on the outside. You don't need to put any interfacing on these pieces. You want these to have a little bit of give. That's why they're on the bias. I'm going to have top stitching in various places on my shirt dress, so I've just done a few little mock-ups before I start, just some single needle and twin needle, just to see what I like the look of, so I can work out what I want in certain places, and I know already what they're going to look like. So these 2 look the best to me. So 1 that's just a couple of mil from the seam, and then 1 with the 2 rows. The first thing I'm going to do is my centre front placket. So I'm going to separate both of these pieces, and I need to fold and stitch this where these lines are here that I've already done. So the best way to do this is if I just fold this like this, I can just transfer these lines with a pin. So I've got 2 positions. So as written here, this one that I've pinned here is the edge of the button stand. I'm not going to mark where my centre front one is. And this one is this line here, which is where I'm folding it. So if I just put those pins in like this, if I show you, this one is where it's going to be folded. And this one is just a little bit shorter than where that one is. And that's going to be folded again. And then it's all going to be stitched. So I'm going to do 1 row of stitching at the side, and I'm going to do the other one to hold this in position here, and then my button will sit in between the 2. You might want to do yours a different way. There's lots of other ways, decorative ways, but this is a nice basic way. You end up with 3 layers of fabric, so it gives it a little bit more body than just a thin fabric. You can add interfacing to this centre front as well, but I don't want to add anything too stiff to this, because as I sit down, I don't want this to be rigid. I want this to just nicely fold when I sit. So I'm now going to iron all of this before I'm ready to sew it. So I'm going to just take those 2 pins out. So I've got my 2 lines here. And the easiest way for me to iron this is just to measure the same distance as these 2 pins all the way down, and then I can just go and iron my 2 positions in place before I sew it up. So I've ironed one side of this and pinned it. So you can see by where I put the pins in and measured it, I've done 1 crease there, and then I've done the 2nd crease here, and I'm just pinning that ready to sew. So I just need to sew where I've decided to do my top stitch. So I'm going to do 1 line just inside here to catch that, and then 1 a couple of millimeters from the edge. So if I lay that next to that one, you can see how much smaller that is. It's basically been folded under and then folded under again. So that's my placket done. I've done 2 rows of stitching on this side just because I like the look of it, and 1 row on this side, and my buttonholes are going to be positioned centered to the inside stitch line here and this one. So the best way to know how you want it is just to do a few mock-ups, so you can see how nice and neat that looks on the inside. All the raw edges have been nicely encased in that. And as I said before, you could put interfacing in this if you want, but as I want mine nice and comfy, I don't want any more rigidity than that. It's already 3 layers of fabric, and I feel like that's enough. At this stage, you could put your buttonholes in if you know exactly where you want them positioned, but I prefer to wait until it's finished, because then I can try it on. I'll know where I want my top button because I want this to be worn open, so I know exactly where I want that, and then I'll work out where I want the bottom one to know how far I want it from the hem, and then I'll just space them all evenly. If I decide now where I want that bottom one, and then when I try it on, I want my dress to be a little bit shorter than planned, then it's going to be in the wrong place. So I always do my buttonholes at the end. Now that that's all done, the next bit is to join my side front to my centre front. So I'm just going to do this seam here. It's got a small seam allowance, which is going to make it a lot easier to work around the curves. So the bottom bit's really straightforward, and then make sure you've got all of this lined up, and then just this bust seam here needs to be eased on. So you just need to make sure you get the top bit lined up perfectly. You need to match up where you're sewing it like this, not actually at the edge, and then just ease this on. If you've got fabric that frays, you might want to use a bigger seam allowance, but if you haven't, then a small seam allowance makes it much easier to ease on the curved seams. So that's my front seam ready to go, and then I'm going to do exactly the same on my back. So I'm going to open up my centre back, and then I'm going to join the centre back to the side back down these seams here. So for both the back and the front seams, I'm going to stitch it, and then I'm going to overlock it once it's stitched, and then just like this I'm going to do a row of top stitch, just 1 single row of top stitch down these seams here. I've now got my back all panelled up, and I've got 2 bits for the front, and everything's got a little bit of top stitch, so it's all overlocked or serged on the back and then just top stitched down here, or you can do a couple of rows, it's totally up to you. So that's the main panels done. So I'm going to put the front aside for now, and the next thing I need to do is to attach my yoke, which is double layered. So what I need to do is I need one like this, and the other one will have the right side showing on the inside. So they kind of need to sandwich in this piece here. So I'm going to put right sides together on the outside, and then I'm going to put the right side facing the wrong side as well. So I've pinned all 3 layers across there, and I just need to sew that together so it encases this back panel. I've got all that now sewn on, so that's how it should look. And then my seam allowance, I'm just going to cut 1 layer a little bit shorter, just so there isn't a ridge of 3 layers of fabric, all with the edges in the same place. And now that that's trimmed, I'm just going to pull both of these this direction, and I can just do my top stitching along the yoke seam. That's my yoke now attached with a double row of top stitch. So the next thing I need to do is I need to join my front on at the shoulders. So if I look at this side, I want to join my shoulder onto that shoulder, but I don't want to go through both of these layers. So the inside layer, just leave that hanging down, and then you just want to join your shoulder on these 2 layers here. So as you look at the inside, this yoke isn't attached to anything yet. We'll do that in a minute. And you just want to be sewing your front to your back on both shoulders, right sides together. So I now need to finish off this shoulder seam. So the easiest way to do it, this needs to basically be folded that way. So all you need to do is fold in that first little bit there and just put a pin in it. Just make sure that's all lined up. And then you can just pull this around like this. And then you've got access to the inside of that shoulder seam. So I just need to join this layer to what I've already just sewn, and that'll be that finished off. So if I just tuck that back through, you can see how it should look. So it might be worth just double checking yours is positioned correctly before you sew it. So what you should have is that shoulder seam sewn up, and then when you turn everything the right way around, you've got a yoke and the front and back, and you can't see any of the seams at all. So I'm just going to go back on the inside and just trim 1 of the 3 seam allowances, and then I can just get my top stitch on to match this one here. My shoulder seams are now done, so I've done my top stitch to match what I've got on the yoke seam here. And then while doing that, I've also just joined both the layers on that little bit on the armhole and on the neck on the yoke. On a shirt, you usually put the sleeve in before you sew up your side seams. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. So this is the back of my sleeve here, and this is my back panel. So I just need to put right sides together and join those on. Unless you've added any gather at the top, you shouldn't have too much to ease in, so it should be nice and straightforward. So that is the piece I need to put on, and I'm just going to pin this all the way around. I just need to work my way around this armhole seam, pinning my sleeve on. So if you have got any easing to do, you just want to start that from kind of halfway up on each side. You just want to ease in the head. If you haven't cut your sleeve too full, then you probably won't need to do any easing in at all. If you've added a gather or anything like that, then I would suggest doing a running stitch here just to gather it up before you pin it on. But this shirt dress that I'm making doesn't have a gather. I've only got a little bit to ease in, so I'm just going to take my time working around the sleeve head until it sits nice and flat. I only had about 1 centimetre to ease in, so it was absolutely fine doing it just with pins. So if you are doing that, have your sleeve on the top because you can see exactly what's going on. The risk you have if you put the sleeve underneath is that you might stretch this piece to get it to fit the sleeve. You don't want to stretch this side to fit the sleeve. You want to ease the sleeve on to fit the armhole. So that's now ready to sew. So I'm just going to do exactly like these other seams and I'm going to stitch it, overlock it, and then do my top stitching. If you are doing top stitching, you want to push your seam allowance this way and do your stitching on the body, not on the sleeve. I've got my sleeves now attached, so as I said, you want to push the seam towards the body, away from the sleeve. You don't want to push it out towards the sleeve. I've just done a single row of top stitch. You could do a double row or something decorative, or you don't have to do any stitching here at all if you don't want to. So that's the sleeves now attached. So now that the sleeves are attached, the next bit is to do the side seam. So we do the side seam of the dress or shirt if you're doing a short version, and the sleeve all in one go. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to flip the sleeve over, so you have your sleeve hem like that, and then the inside seam here, you just want the right sides together, and then the armhole seam there will meet, and then your front and back right sides together all the way down the side. And this seam is just done in one go, so I'm going to get this seam done now on both sides of my dress. Now that the side seams are done, that's the main bit of this dress put together. So I've got left my hems on the cuffs and at the bottom, and obviously my collar and all the buttons. I've cut my hem at the bottom with a total of 3.5 centimetres hem allowance. So I've put these pins at 1.5 centimetres from the bottom, and I'm going to iron a crease there. So that's my first bit turned over and pressed, and then I'm having them slightly different lengths just to stagger it so it doesn't get bunched up. So all I'm going to do is exactly the same and fold it on those pins and press it, and then it's ready to sew. When I'm folding this bit in the bottom corner of the placket, what I don't want to do is just fold it up like that, because you're going to have a bit hanging out the side here. So all I'm going to do is just fold that under a little bit here, and then when I fold it up, I don't have any raw edges coming out of there. To keep the little bit that I've folded over in, I've just put a few stitches down there, and that will keep that in. So when I fold it over like that, nothing then comes out. So when I stitch it, I'm going to just stitch along this little bit here to hold that together in line with where that top stitching is, and then I'll just continue all the way around the hem. So it's nice and neat, both sides, no loose ends, everything is nicely encased. It just needs a little bit of a press to finish it off. So the same way that I did the main hem, I've done the cuff. So I've turned it back 2.25 centimetres and pressed it, and then I've turned it back 2.5 centimetres and I've pressed it. And when I stitch it, I'm not going to do like I did at the hem and sew it right at the edge. I'm going to sew it at this point here, which is 1.5 centimetres. And once I sew that, I'm going to be able to turn it back like this, and it's going to sit in exactly the right place, and it'll look like that on the inside. So I've ironed all this ready on both cuffs, and I now just need to sew all the way around at 1.5 centimetres. And this now just needs a press to hold it in place, but that is how it looks. So everything is encased nice and neatly, and you've got a turn up that will stay in place. So you can do it this way, or you can just have a regular hem. You can do this cuff edge however you like, but that's the way I decided to do it to give it a little bit of detail on this dress. So I've laid the inside collar on top of the outer collar that's got the interfacing. I need to line this up perfectly, so I'm going to start by joining it at this point here, and then I'm going to join it at the point, and then that's that front bit finished off. And I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side, and then this should all sit nice and flat here. And I'm just going to put a pin through the centre, and then just by literally swiveling it round like that and then just moving it, I've got these bits lined up perfectly. So now I'm just going to work my way along that edge and just pin that all the way along, ready to sew. So I just need to sew this 1 centimetre around, which is my seam allowance, and it helps to make sure you get this in the right position. You can use a vanishing pen, but I prefer just to use pins. So if I put that one in that direction, I'll take this one out, and then I'll measure 1 centimetre from this side here. And I know that where these cross over, so this point here, that is where I need to pivot when I'm sewing it. So as I sew up here, I just need to maintain the 1 centimetre, and I'll pull this pin out as I do it. I just need to make sure this is where I pivot to go around this point on the collar. So now that I've got nearer, I've just repositioned this pin to the exact point I need to sew to. And I'm just going to hand wind this around until I get to that point. And I've now stopped with the needle in exactly that point. Apologies for not filming myself actually sewing it, but sewing with a tripod between me and the needle is hard to do it this fiddly. So I'm now just going to turn that around like that. And I just need to make sure you can see here how that's slipped a little bit there. You can see the underneath fabric. So I just need to rejig that and then I can carry on sewing. And you can see now I've repinned it and you can't see that. Don't worry about this bit here, that's just where it's moved as I've turned it. So I just now need to sew down the length of the collar and do exactly the same on the other point. So just make sure your stitching is nice and even, and then you can just give all of this a trim, and you need to just trim a little bit closer at that point there. Don't trim too close because you could end up with fraying, so you don't want to go too close there. But I'm just going to trim it nice and close all the way around. I'm trimming this down to about 4 or 5 millimeters. So before I do the top stitch, what I'm doing is I'm flipping this over. The seam allowance is pointing this direction into the outer collar, and I'm just ironing it so that the seam allowance goes that way. And when I come to do my top stitching, it's just going to make it that little bit easier. So you need to kind of just keep checking that that seam allowance is going in that direction, and go all along the length of the collar, and you can do the little tiny bits here on the ends, but you can't get into the point, but it'll just help when it comes to top stitching it. So by doing that, it's made it now nice and easy for me to turn that under, and you can see it's already got a nice fold on it, so it's just going to make it even easier. And it looks like it's sitting, and if I put a pin here for where that's going to be stitched together, it looks like that's sitting a fair bit in, but actually once it folds over, that's going to sit perfectly. So I now need to just turn out the points, and I'm going to use a pin just to pull this point out here. You can get little gadgets to do it. There is a technique where you use a bit of thread as you're sewing it, but if you take your time with a pin, that's all you need just to get this point out like this. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to iron all the way around. This has now been pressed, and I don't know how well you can see it in the video, but you can see just this tiny little bit of the outer fabric poking through, and you can see a little bit on this side here, but as soon as I fold it over, you'll see how that gets smaller, and that's just helping this all sit perfectly. So now that that's done, I'm just going to top stitch around my collar. This is all now top stitched all around the collar point. So what I need to do is I just need to line up these 2 edges here, and I'm just going to pin it all the way along with these lined up perfectly, and I'm just going to stitch this together down the length of the collar. My collar is now complete, so I've stitched this across here, and you can see when I fold it that because I've put the bias on the inside, it just helps this not to bunch up inside. If it was cut on the straight of grain, it would just be more likely to bunch up. You don't have to do it on the bias. Sometimes you don't have enough fabric to, or you might be thinking about which way the pattern runs, but if you can, I'd always advise to do the inside on the bias. I've put my collar aside, and I now need to put my collar stand onto my dress. So this is the collar stand part that you see. So I found the center point of that just by folding it in half, and likewise on the back. And I'm gonna just join these 2 together first at that exact point, so I know they are in exactly the right position. So I'm just going to pin that, and then I'm going to pin at the center front. So this collar stand has a 1 centimeter seam allowance, so I'm going to put a pin at the 1 centimeter point, and that's where I'm going to line up my placket. Oops. So if I just put it straight like that, and then I'm going to sit my placket right against that pin and put a pin through there. And then what I need to do is I just need to do the same on the other side, and then just pin all along this. This should fit perfectly. You shouldn't have to ease this in. You can see how good that is, and that is all down to how you measure this neck curve when you're drafting your collar and collar stand. That's all now pinned on all the way along, and as I said, there was no easing to do. It's just a case of just positioning the centre on either side, pinning it on, and I'm just now going to go and sew that 1 centimetre from the edge, and that will be my collar stand on. Once that's sewn on, you just need to trim it. I never like to trim right at the end until I'm completely done. So I'm just going to trim this all the way along, and then I'm going to press this up into the collar stand. So I'm going to press all of this direction here. Once you've trimmed and pressed that up, the next thing is to put your collar on. If, like me, you've used 2 different fabrics, it's really obvious which way round it goes. If you haven't done that, then just make sure you get it the right way round. So you want your collar sitting like this once it's finished. So that's how you need to sew it on. The collar stand on the inside will go on in a second and keep that in place. But this is how it needs to look. So you need to find the centre point of your collar, easiest way being to just fold it. You can do a little snip when you're cutting it out, but it's so easy just to fold it at this stage. So that's my collar, and I need to do exactly the same on my collar stand. And then I need to make sure that I sew this to the correct point on this curve. So if you look back at your pattern, on your pattern when you were drawing it, you have this line coming down here, and then you will have drawn your collar from this point here. So I've just drawn a little line on here where that collar joins on. So you just need to put this back onto your garment, so you can line the pattern up with the placket edge and this edge on your collar stand with this seam, or if you've put a seam allowance on your collar stand, you can just line it up with the edge. And all I'm going to do is just put a pin where that mark is, and that tells me that this is where I need to put my collar on here. So I'm just going to do that on the other side and get this all pinned on, ready to sew. This is how it should look once you've got the collar pinned on. It seems a little bit wrong because you've got this edge at the top, and obviously that's not how it's going to look, but this is how it should be pinned on. So I'm now going to just stitch this on 1 centimetre from the edge all the way around. Just make sure your collar is nice and even before you start sewing. So the last bit of doing this collar is getting this inner collar stand on. So I've cut 1 centimetre all the way around, other than this little bit here where I did 8 millimetres. So at the bottom here, I've folded it up by 7 millimetres. And once I get my collar stand in, it means that this, rather than sitting where the stitch line is, it's going to sit just over, just to hide that. And then I can top stitch this last bit here. So to get this sewn on, I just need to flip my dress over, and I need to push my collar down onto the dress, and then I just need to stitch this all the way around. So I need to, if I unfold both of these, it means I can get it in exactly the right position. So I'm just going to pin that there, and then I'm just going to work my way around to the other side and get this all pinned on. So I've unfolded this at the end, and I'm gonna just push this direction here, just right at this end here, to get this sewn on. So I'm gonna sew this all 1 centimetre from the edge and just have both of these seam allowances pointing this direction to do it. So I'm just gonna sew all the way around to the other side. When you're sewing this little bit here, just make sure, you can see how I've pinned through the collar, just make sure you haven't done that. When you're sewing it, make sure the collar is pulled well out of the way. If you accidentally go over it, just unpick it and sew this little bit here again. Once you've sewn all of that on, just make sure you've got the nice shape on the front. Until you trim it, it's not going to be nice and rounded, but just make sure that all looks okay. And pull this down and make sure that that sits over that there, and then you can trim off all this excess. I don't like to trim everything too short because I want to stagger these seams, or I'm going to have a ridge. So I'm going to leave this bias one as it is because that molds the best. I'm going to trim the collar down the most, and I'm going to go somewhere in between with this collar stand, and it will just stagger this big ridge that I've got here. For this curve here, I do need to trim this nice and short, or it's never going to sit nicely when I come to press and top stitch that. So I'm just going to trim all of that nice and short there. And then at this point here, where this placket is, I'm just going to trim that little bit off there as well. Now that that's all trimmed, this has a nice curve. I'll press that and top stitch that in a minute. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch around the entire collar stand. So that's all trimmed. This seam allowance here is going into the collar stand, and then this flips over, and where this fold is here, it needs to sit just past where that stitch line is. So I'm going to just start in the center, and I'm going to pin over it like this. And I'm going to work my way around the whole collar stand, pinning with the collar stand just overlapping that seam just by about 1 or 2 millimeters. And I'll work my way to the center front. So where this point is here, you just need to fold that in and then fold that like this. And you've got the 1 centimetre seam allowance on both pieces. The bit where you've pressed that slightly smaller so it overhangs, that will just, you need to just kind of smooth that out just as it gets away from that point there. So if I put a pin in here, then I can take this one out, and I just need to kind of play around with that to get that in the right place. So that's the centre front and the back, and I just need to go all the way around this bit and then obviously do the same on this side. And just look how neat that now looks, now that's all pinned in place. So I need to stitch this. I want it to look perfect on the outside and on the inside. So I'm going to change my thread colour for this side, and I just want to make sure that where I stitch it is going to be perfect on the outside. So I'm just going to put a few pins through where my stitch line is, just so I can see on the outside exactly where that's going to go. And you can see there it goes just inside that seam, which is where I want it to be. So that is absolutely perfect. I'm going to do that all the way along before I start top stitching it. And then when I do it, I'm going to top stitch down this bit, and then I'm just going to continue all the way around. So I'm just going to change my top thread to black so I can stitch along here, and I'll keep the pink underneath for this bit. So that's now all stitched on around the bottom, and you can see the stitch line sits just inside there. Don't worry if your stitching doesn't look absolutely perfect on this side. No one is going to be, hopefully, no one's going to be walking up to you and lifting your collar up and checking your stitching. Now that I know this bit's all sitting right, I'm just going to carry on and go all the way around here. And that's the collar now all finished. So my last little bit is just to do my buttons and buttonholes. So the traditional side to have the buttonholes on a female garment is on the right as you wear it. You can do it the other way around if you prefer. So I'm going to put some machine automatic buttonholes on this side, and I'm just going to sew my buttons on this side. So I've tried my dress on to see where the bottom button goes. That's kind of crucial because you want to be decent. So that's the position of that, and the top one is obviously going to go on the collar stand. And then I just need to space the rest of them. So I just do it by eye to work out how many I need. I don't want loads of buttons too close together. I equally don't want them too far apart so it opens up. So this is how many buttons I'm going to go with, and I'm just spacing these evenly along here. So all I need to do is just take the total measurement. I've not pressed it yet, so I'm just going to give it a tiny little pull because it's not yet pressed. So I'm going to measure from the bottom to the top, and that's 63 centimeters. And I don't divide it by how many buttons there are, I divide it by how many spaces there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've got 7 spaces, and that's nice and easy because I know that 63 divided by 7 is 9. That was just a bit of a stroke of luck, really. So just get a calculator if you need to work it out. So all I'm going to do is just space these pins 9 centimeters apart, and that's all my positions for my buttonholes and for my buttons. So the buttonhole on the collar stand needs to go this direction, and the buttonholes on the button stand go in this direction. So I'm just going to do automatic machine stitch buttonholes, and I'm going to center them between the outside top stitching and this inside top stitching here, so they're centered at that point. And then likewise, when I sew the buttons on, they're just going to be centered and in these same positions. So once I've done the buttons and buttonholes, I just need to give it a good press and it's finally ready to wear. So before I ever do a buttonhole on an actual garment, I always do a trial run. So if you're lucky to have a machine with an automatic buttonhole where you can put the button in the buttonhole foot, then this makes it lovely and easy. So that's all done and ready to try out. If you've not seen a foot like this before, it's for sewing on buttons. So you need to line up with 2 pins, or you can draw it with chalk, where your button needs to go, and then just drop the foot down. I'm going to sew this once I've moved the camera because I can't get close enough to see if it's in exactly the right place. But you need to drop the feeders from underneath because you don't want it moving the fabric. So you have no stitch length, and you need to set the width of your stitch to whatever the width is between the holes on your button. So if I just show you quickly, I've got the zigzag set up so it lines up perfectly for stitching through those holes. I'm not going to do any more than that before I move the tripod and make sure this is in exactly the right spot, but that's basically how you can sew your buttons on if you don't want to do them all by hand. That's all of my buttons and buttonholes now done, so I just need to cut all the threads off, cut my buttonholes open, and my dress is completely finished. You saw it at the beginning and here it is again. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and it's shown you everything you need to know to make a shirt or a shirt dress like this. If you did enjoy it, make sure you check out my other videos and you subscribe to my channel as I post new tutorials every single week.